Francisca. It's basically the order of confirmation, that one that I have, but I moved Delia up, so she's first. Okay.
At my request, because it's midnight, Alec. It's midnight.
I
I
know.
thought it would be
I'm
midnight.
very sort of grateful.
Do you have your wine over there,
No,
Delia?
coffee, darling. I've been so good. Not been drinking all evening. So I can,
See, I've been using the mugs, but not for coffee when it's later in the evening.
Gotta be April.
She's having coffee because she wants to be awake to listen to you, Alan.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so un minuto, ¿verdad? We're starting now. Muy buenos días. Bienvenidos a la última sesión, al último día de esta semana del COVID, del Global Congress en Propiedad Intelectual e Interés Público. Es para mí, Carolina Botero, directora de la Fundación Carisma, un placer darle la bienvenida a esta sesión y recordarles que todo va a quedar grabado, que hemos tenido una semana fabulosa con muchas personas interviniendo, hablando, con nuestro fan número 1, Alan Rocha, quien está de nuevo acá para su cuarta sesión, y con, bueno, un montón de gente que nos acompañó para hablar de esta importante relación entre propiedad intelectual e interés público, que si no consideramos esta combinación debido a una pandemia, pues creo que tenemos problemas. Esta sesión es sobre educación en tiempos de COVID. Pensar cuál es la situación, o sea, la educación requiere de conocimiento, de compartir conocimiento, de comunicar conocimiento, y por eso los profesores, educadores, tanto en la educación formal como informal, han tenido siempre la facultad y le hemos dado el poder para que enseñen y muestren lo que quieran, porque queremos que nuestros estudiantes que tengan un espíritu crítico, y eso se aprende siendo expuestos a cualquier cosa. Por eso el aula de clases siempre ha sido un sitio privilegiado y que queda por fuera de las regulaciones. Normalmente hablamos de independencia académica, hablamos de libertad académica, hablamos también de excepciones y limitaciones. Dentro del aula, el maestro puede hacer, digamos, lo que quiera, mostrar cualquier contenido. Pero ¿qué sucede cuando el aula y todo el proceso de aprendizaje, porque más allá incluso de la docencia, en la parte de investigación y demás, se convierte en digital? Cuando todas las actividades que allí suceden pasan en lo digital. Bien, esa es la gran pregunta. Y mientras organizábamos esta sesión, nos preguntábamos qué pasó con el movimiento de educación abierta. ¿Qué pasó cómo funcionó la educación a distancia? ¿Estábamos preparados para este desafío? Sin duda, el desafío va más allá, digamos, del derecho de autor o de la propiedad intelectual. El primer problema está en la conectividad, en el uso e incluso en lo que llamamos apropiación, en las capacidades de utilizar esa tecnología. Yo hablo desde Colombia, donde tenemos apenas 50% del país conectado, y digamos, uno podría decir, afortunadamente ya tenemos el 50% del país conectado, pero ese 50% del país que está conectado, pues a ver qué tipo de conexiones tienen y cómo funcionan. Cuando medimos la conexión por hogar y todo se digitaliza, ¿quiénes son los marginados de esa conexión? Porque si el papá tiene que trabajar, pues él es el que va a tenerlo. Si la mamá, la segunda conexión puede que sea para ella, seguramente los niños van a quedar sin una. ¿Cómo funciona eso? Es verdaderamente un problema. Pero concentrémonos entonces en qué sucede cuando la educación se convierte en digital, y dejemos un poco de lado ese otro reto sustancial del acceso, uso y apropiación. En ese caso, ¿cuáles fueron los principales desafíos y retos que enfrentaron las instituciones que tuvieron que acelerar y universalizar sus servicios educativos. Los estados, ¿qué pasó con los estados? ¿Cuáles fueron los desafíos que enfrentaron? Uno de esos, por supuesto, fue la propiedad intelectual. ¿Cómo hacer para distribuir contenidos? Y repito, cualquier tipo de contenido para el proceso de aprendizaje. O quizás estamos pensando en un problema que no existe. ¿Es acaso el problema de la propiedad intelectual en educación solamente un problema de las sociedades conectadas y ricas? Porque resulta que el resto de los países que tenemos unos problemas de inequidad económica y social muy importantes, pues al final tienen tan pobre educación virtual que esto no es un problema. ¿O simplemente no nos importa? Todas estas preguntas nos llevaron a diseñar un panel que va a hacerle como una vuelta al mundo en hora y media. Un mundo que elegimos y en el que queremos mostrar una gran diversidad. Con nosotros entonces, esta mañana, tarde o noche, según donde se encuentren ustedes, vamos a tener a 6 conferencistas que nos muestren lo que está pasando desde diferentes lugares del mundo y quizá desde diferentes posiciones también. Los invito entonces a acompañarnos en este viaje alrededor del mundo. Esto no va a ser un panel, esto va a ser más un viaje alrededor del mundo para escuchar experiencias y que cada uno de nosotros nos quedemos pensando en qué está pasando y qué podríamos hacer para mejorar. Yo hasta aquí hablé en español. A partir de ahora, para facilitar el tema, pues continuaré seguramente en inglés, pero les recuerdo a todos ustedes que si estamos viéndolo en vivo, deben simplemente escoger el idioma porque tenemos traducción en inglés, español y portugués. Comienzo entonces, sin más preámbulos, con mi primera invitada. Delia Brown is head of Australia's National Copyright Unit, which provides specialist copyright advice to Australian schools and the technical and further education (TAFE) sector. She is part of CC Board of Creative Commons Board as well. Delia has been one of the most important open advocates and has been a role model for me. I'm very, very glad to welcome Delia to speak with us for as the first speaker. Thank you, Delia, for being here, despite the fact that you are midnight over there.
Oh, thanks, Carolina, and thanks for inviting me to participate, the organizers of the Global Congress. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge where I'm speaking from you today is in Sydney, Australia, but I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of where I'm speaking from, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge that any traditional custodians of the various lands of people who are joining us today. So, and also kia ora to my whānau back in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is where I originally come from. So just to give you a bit of background, as Carolina mentioned, I'm the director of the National Copyright Unit. And throughout this little talk today, I'm going to refer to us as NCU rather than the National Copyright Unit. And what we do is we're a specialist copyright legal team that provides copyright advice to the Australian school sector. And as Carolina mentioned, the Technical Advanced Further Education, which I call TAFE. And we also negotiate and manage the licenses on behalf of both the school sector and the TAFE sector with the Australian Copyright Collecting Societies. And we also spend a lot of time advocating for copyright law reform that benefits education. And probably over the last 10 or so years, the NCU has been strongly advocating for copyright law reform to reflect changes to teaching practices, particularly with the use of technology. So our current laws in Australia, like probably most countries, are largely focused on the use of print materials in a school, within the physical boundaries of a school. And they lack the flexibility to deal with changes with technology, including the increased use of internet materials and online delivery of learning. So in 2014, the Australian Law Reform Commission released a report which discussed the outdated nature of Australia's education copyright laws. And the report kind of recommended for a simplification of our statutory education licenses and also said we need to introduce a broad and flexible fair use exception to replace Australia's many existing exceptions, or at least the introduction of a new exception that allows fair dealing for education, as you have in the UK and Canada and Singapore. 2016, a similar conclusion was actually reached by the Productivity Commission. They also released a report in 2016, and they said Australia's copyright arrangements lack balance and have been slow to adapt to technological change and posing costs on the broader community. So they also supported the Australian Law Reform Commission recommendation of an introduction of a fair use exception. Then following that, we've had, following both those reports, the Australian Law Reform Commission report and Productivity Commission report, the Australian government conducted a copyright modernisation consultation with lots of stakeholders, including education. And so they've just very recently, watch this space, announced that they intend to introduce a copyright amendment bill, hopefully later this year, an exposure draft, which will be released for public consultation. And they've said this bill will give greater access to copyright material for education institutions, cultural institutions, and they will also clarify the operation of existing copyright exceptions. So it's very clear the government's not intending to give us a fair use or give us a fair dealing for education. What they want to try and do is clarify our existing exceptions to try and improve access to copyright materials for education institutions in line with modern technologies. But, you know, it's going to be, the devil's going to be in the detail. It's going to be the thing. Now, COVID-19 hit Australia. And this, again, I think really showed, it was disruptive. I mean, we had to go from face-to-face learning to online virtual learning. And again, that transition from the physical school to the online virtual school just showed again how outdated our copyright laws were. And so just to explain to you how it was for us, because suddenly we had to transition 10,000 schools in Australia to kind of virtual online learning. During that period of time, I think from March, which when the schools were locked down, we had over a 270% increase in requests for copyright advice from the schools and TAFE sector. I think in a period of about 4 or 5 months, we had done over 500 copyright advices. We had over 185% increase to the number of website visits from schools to our website, which is, you know, www.smartcopying.edu.au, which is a really good place to have a look at. I'm going to refer to a few things in my little chat today. So, you know, there was one day there was like probably about 45,000 views of our information sheets about how to deal with copyright and COVID. So we had to be very fast, we had to be very flexible, and we had to like respond very quickly because there's a lot of panic and stress from principals and school teachers. And so we couldn't just rely on our exceptions, although we did for some, but we had to negotiate, for instance, a really quick interim license with the Australian Music Collecting Societies, because what we had to do is enable schools to provide sheet music to students. And our current license only allows us to do photocopies. It didn't allow us to have digital copies or to email digital copies or to make digital copies available on what I call a digital teaching environment. We negotiated an Australian Storytime agreement with the Australian Society of Authors and the Australian Publishers Association, and that was allowing teachers to read stories aloud to their students using Zoom, but also to record them reading stories to primary kids and to kindergarten kids during that time as well. We then had to publish, like super quickly, a number of information guides to help schools know what they can and cannot do, and also try and give some practical advice, pushing, I suppose, because it's special circumstances with COVID, pushing and trying to give some practical advice without turning them into copyright lawyers. So we did that for schools, and we also worked with the various departments of education who create curriculum materials for students, also working with them at how to do this very quickly as well. So during this crisis, and it is a crisis, an ongoing crisis, schools were forced to move to remote learning, but there's a lot of legal uncertainty as to how to share copyright materials with their students studying remotely, where those materials would normally be delivered inside a classroom, a physical classroom. So COVID-19 really confirmed the need, I suppose, for an urgent update of our copyright law. At the same time, also it demonstrated how a flexible exception can actually work in these sort of special cases. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things here. So I'm going to talk about two sections of Australia's Copyright Act. One is Section 28 and one is Section 200AB. So Section 28 is what I often refer to as the show and tell exception. This allows teachers to show copyright content to students in a classroom. So that would be playing a film or music to a class, reading a text to a class, or displaying artistic works to a class. It could be using an interactive whiteboard, could be performing in class. And most jurisdictions, most countries have this show and tell exception. Now, the problem with this exception in Australia, limitations, is it doesn't apply if the teacher is at home speaking to students via Zoom. It doesn't apply if a parent's in the room with the child helping them with their home learning. And it doesn't apply if the teacher wants to record a lesson for students to access on demand during home or for students who are in self-isolation. So the Section 28, it's so old, it's not fit for the purpose during this time. So it needs to be updated. This section needs to be updated to ensure that teachers can show copyright material both in class and during remote lessons if you use Zoom or similar. It also needs to be updated to allow parents or guardians to be present in a lesson and ensure that Section 28 no longer stops at the school gate. So that's one thing that shows the limitations there. It also needs to apply to all different types of copyright content equally. So, we've got a problem in Australia where it's fine to show an artistic work to a class, but it's not fine to display text to a class. It's a very weirdly drafted exception. So it needs to be, those are the changes that need to be made. Now, Section 200AB is different. This is a relatively new exception. I think we got it in 2006. And that's, on the other hand, shown the benefits of having a flexible dealing exception. So I call this the special case exception. Sometimes it's known in Australia as flexible dealing. And this allows 5 minutes? 1 minute. Okay, almost finished. So this exception allows educational institutions to use copyright material in special cases, as long as the use does not conflict with the normal exploitation of the work or unreasonably prejudice the interests of the copyright owner. So this exception is usually used for copying extracts of film or format shifting a film into a different format if you can't buy the film in the format you need to show to the class. So what we're able to do during COVID-19, because it's a special case exception, teachers were able to rely on this to record classes or lessons for students on access on demand. So teachers could use copyright materials in their lessons, provided they streamed only, for instance, made sure there was no further copies or downloads were being made, limited that recording or access to the students who needed to view it in that class, only make it available for the time you need for the course of study, and after that, you should disable access and take it off the digital teaching environment. And so that flexibility of that exception really demonstrates that a flexible approach is great because we're able to rely on that during this particular circumstances. But the problem now is as we begin to now return to normality, whatever the new normal is, it's still showing you what's permitted in a special case and how the law applies to everyday teaching is pretty stark. So COVID-19 has shown the light on benefits and the need for flexibility at the same time. And of course, I'll still press hard to make the changes to the law. Thanks very much, Carolina.
Thank you very much, Delia. So we're moving from Australia to Europe, and from a perspective, a state perspective, which is the one that Delia has shown us in a very schematic way, sorry, trying to balance the needs of the teachers with what the law had to offer. To Alek Tarkowski is from Poland. He's the CEO at Centrum Cyfrow and member of the Creative Commons board as well. He is activist, strategist, policymaker, enthusiastic, sociologist of the digital world. So Alec has worked a lot in Europe in following and dealing with the nuances of copyright. And well, anybody who knows the European landscape will know Alec as well. So thank you, Alec, for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to provide a perspective on remote education and the kind of copyright that it requires, a perspective from Europe. At the same time, I have a sense that we're all facing similar challenges. They are not exactly the same. They vary in intensity between regions, but I think the overall picture is very similar, and we discussed this a bit with the panelists. So I'm mindful that I don't want to repeat some of the things that Delia said and that other speakers will say, but I want to highlight one issue that I think connects us all, and that's digital divide. And this is my personal story, that when the pandemic started, when in March, I received a text message saying on Monday, please don't bring children to school. They will most probably start remote education. And this happened from day to day. The first thing I thought about is digital divide. Digital divide is obviously didn't disappear yet. There are big problems across the world with connectivity, with access, but at least in Europe, I think we started pretending it doesn't exist. So we didn't, for instance, worry that some children don't have the right equipment at home, because we were mainly thinking whether they have equipment at school. And there was never enough equipment at school, but it was just good enough. You know, there are computer classrooms, there are some sufficient lessons. So over the years, I think we stopped talking so much about it. And in the pandemic, this became crucial. And we did a study where we found out that at least 20%, and we think it's higher, but 20% is the conservative estimate, of all students in primary and lower secondary education, so the first 12 grades of education, we're facing some form of digital divide. They almost all have telephones, though we found out there's around 100,000 children who don't even have that, and that's for me a sign of being very, very excluded. But other than phones, and we know it's very hard to learn on a phone, the most typical problem was either the internet connection wasn't good enough, especially for teleconferences, or their data plan was too small, or there were computers or, let's say, tablets at home, but the number was insufficient. And the last thing we found, which is not often discussed as digital divide, but I think is fundamental, is the quality of living at home. If you live in a very small home, if you share a room maybe with your siblings who are at school as well, and your parents who are at work, this is also a form of divide. And I know this doesn't translate directly into copyright, but I think this is a fundamental perspective, and I will come back to this at the end. I really feel this is a time where we need to see the bigger picture and start dealing also with sort of issues that are not always about copyright, but they're certainly about public interest, which is the topic also of this Congress, or maybe even of social justice. Another thing I want to highlight is that no matter where in the world, almost everyone jumped into remote education with very little experience. So there was great need for advice how to do it, for meaningful solutions, for good content, and for useful services. So in this context, I want to highlight two parts of a response that relates to intellectual property. So one has to do with copyright law, and the other has to do with all sorts of open education models. When it comes to copyright law, what I observe in Poland, and I also have knowledge that that seems to be the case in in the rest of Europe is that I feel we're in a kind of copyright gray zone. So certainly the kinds of activities that teachers started doing online are not covered by copyright exceptions because these are very targeted at school-based learning. And this is very explicit. So in technical terms, they don't cover communication to the public, which the teachers often started doing through through digital communication, and also the copying and distribution of materials. I would say often, if lawyers looked very carefully, they would reach sometimes disturbing for them conclusions. But no such looking into happened, and I think the reason for it is that we made a kind of a social pact that this is an emergency, and I think it's very good we did it, right? So, for instance, Poland, there was one very narrow policy debate about reprographic fees, which to some extent concerns schools, but overall, this topic of copyright in education was sort of left aside. But I don't think this state of things can go on for a long time. This is just a emergency approach, and I think we need a long-term approach. And I think the long-term approach, this probably will be repeated by other panelists, is one where we need to have this covered by an exception that provides a stable basis for educations to conduct digital and remote education. And the reason that we need it is the very same reason we have an educational exception for school-based teaching. But I think the other part I want to highlight, and this was important in Poland, is that quite a lot can be achieved by voluntary releasing of resources. Poland, as you might know, has a history that started 10 years ago in 2011 of developing a suite of open digital textbooks. They're modular, so actually it's a collection of resources that can be aggregated into textbooks. Started in 2011. The textbooks were released in 2015. And to be honest, for 5 years, were not very much used because no one made an effort to, alongside these resources, provide trainings to teachers, explain to them how they can be used. And they haven't been used since until March, when suddenly the fact that they exist was really an extremely good situation that we were in. And according to official data, their usage jumped from day to day from tens of thousands of visitors to several million. So this became a research that basically became commonly used by everyone. So this is for me a very important story that open resources make sense. They're not only open, they are public. From what we know when we are studying this right now, teachers have been using a lot of resources, but ultimately they have a lot of faith in public resources. They count on public resources, they trust them. That's why these usage levels are so high. So I think that in this overall big picture, alongside arguments for good copyright, we should be talking a lot about, I like to think today, not just use the term open, but a lot about this is public, that it's very beneficial that there are proper public resources. We secured in Poland the issue of textbooks, but for instance, I wish, but this is, I would say, science fiction. We could, for instance, have other public tools. For instance, it would be amazing if all the teleconferencing was done on a public platform and not necessarily dependent on several commercial providers. So I want to finish by saying that what's important really for me is this broad perspective, because the goals you want to achieve, we cannot solve them all with the means of fixing copyright law or even open licensing. I think that the digital divide is ultimately this pressing need. What this means in practice, I think we probably should look at closer cooperation with other actors who are dealing with these other issues, or maybe even expand our own understanding of our mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much for keeping also on time. It's amazing what you just told. I have to tell you that a few years ago, when we analyzed the situation of the resources, the educational resources available in Colombia, we found out that really it's a matter of the market. So the ministry buys the textbooks for the schools, which also meant that most of the public schools in Colombia does not even have textbooks. And what happened during the COVID is that during 2 or 3 months, the minister was obliged to do some guides, some textbooks, which are basically guides for all public, all the students in the public system. And for many, this was the first time they would have a book in their hands, especially in very far away places in rurality and so on, which was for me a very lightning thing of why are we talking about copyright if most of the students are relying only on what the teachers can tell them. So it's really what you're saying does connect with me very much. And I think that we're jumping now to Latin America to see what happens here and see what the connections are, starting with Mariana
Can I just
Fossati.
quickly, oh, sorry.
Sure, sure, go on.
Can I just quickly mention, because this is important, you know, there is always challenge when doing these comparisons that I describe a European situation where we feel a crisis, but then you say, well, where I am, there are problems with textbooks. I have to reply to this, well, we should be grateful in Poland that this kind of problem, we do have textbooks. So I just want to say I'm very mindful that the situation varies, and the challenges probably in many places are a lot bigger than in Poland, but still, you know, I think structurally they are the same, and that's maybe also important to underline that we can help each other on finding the solutions.
Totally,
Okay,
because
thank
I
you.
mean, I'm talking from Colombia, which is one of the most unequal countries in the world. So the situation of you described in Poland would be probably the situation in Bogota, you know? So it's really those kind of inequalities that also makes the big problem with public education, I believe. But yeah, it's just to connect something. Anyway, we're now jumping to Latin America to Mariana. Mariana Fossati is from Uruguay. Mariana is part of the Creative Commons chapter in Uruguay. She's a sociologist and visual artist. She's a book lover and a Commons fan. And she knows a lot about education in the region. Mariana, please jump in.
Hola, hola a todas y todos. Bueno, voy a hacer mi exposición en español. Bueno, muchas gracias Carolina por la invitación y gracias a mis colegas en el panel. Bueno, voy a empezar hablando un poco de la situación en América Latina y plantear un poco, preguntarnos en qué circunstancias están llegando los estudiantes a recibir clases en línea en este contexto de crisis sanitaria y emergencia, y que se refleja en una emergencia en educación también, y que, bueno, cómo llegan, en qué circunstancias, depende de una cantidad de factores previos que están marcados por la desigualdad social, estructural, que podemos encontrar en América Latina. Y solamente para dar algunas cifras, en América Latina, más del 30% de los hogares no tiene acceso a Internet. Este porcentaje, esta proporción varía de país en país. Carolina nos decía recién que en Colombia es el 50%, en Uruguay es el 10% de hogares que todavía no tienen acceso. O sea, hay una disparidad regional importante, pero ese es el promedio, según CEPAL. Y en este porcentaje, en los hogares rurales es del 77%. Hay aproximadamente 40 millones de hogares que no están conectados en América Latina, y más de la mitad de esos hogares pertenece a los sectores más pobres de la población, al quintil más empobrecido, para quienes el costo de conectividad representa, según CEPAL, según sus cálculos, aproximadamente el 12% de sus ingresos. Y esto nos da como resultado que más de 32 millones de niños y niñas en América Latina no están pudiendo acceder a la educación a distancia en línea. Es por eso que como decía Carolina, también la educación a distancia no es solo educación en línea en América Latina. En estos tiempos se han desplegado distintas iniciativas que tienen que ver, por ejemplo, con los libros, como decía Caro, o, por ejemplo, educación a través de radio y televisión, como por ejemplo el caso de México, que lo está haciendo a través de la televisión. En fin, no es la única opción ni lo único que se está haciendo la educación en línea, y esto obviamente nos tiene que hacer pensar en respuestas desde la perspectiva de reformas del copyright o de excepciones que tengan que ver con los distintos medios y los distintos espacios, y no solamente para la educación en línea. Y también pensar que no hay soluciones rápidas, universales, que den respuesta a la emergencia de una forma masiva, sino que, bueno, nos tenemos que preguntar qué diferentes combinaciones de medios tenemos que desplegar para dar una respuesta. Y también pensar desde la perspectiva de las personas, de los hogares, de los estudiantes, qué tipo de apoyo requieren, si hay que apoyar también la adquisición de planes de datos, de dispositivos, de acercamiento a redes comunitarias para el acceso a Internet, incluso rediseñar de algún modo también las clases y la educación, incorporar soluciones más creativas y comunitarias, como educación entre pares, grupos de personas que generen comunidades de aprendizaje. En fin, la heterogeneidad de nuestras realidades nos tiene que llevar a pensar en una heterogeneidad de respuestas. Pero bueno, me voy a enfocar un poco también ahora en la educación en línea, dicho lo anterior. Y primero que nada, no sé, en estos meses en lo que he reflexionado bastante es en ¿para qué hacemos educación en línea? Y primero que nada, creo que no es para hacer lo mismo que se venía haciendo en educación presencial y en las escuelas, pero tratar de trasladarlo a la educación en línea. Creo que eso es algo que ha ocurrido, que se ha dicho, bueno, hagamos lo mismo pero en Zoom, y no se trata de eso, y que tampoco la educación en línea es el mero consumo de conocimiento, acceso a materiales educativos, descarga, lectura, videos, sino que la educación en línea es un ambiente interactivo, que tal vez no es el mismo tipo de interactividad que en el aula presencial, tiene otras posibilidades, como trabajar de forma asincrónica, en tiempos diferentes, lo que otorga flexibilidades para todo tipo de formatos educativos, y no me refiero solamente a la educación formal en el sistema educativo, sino en algo en que he estado trabajando también bastante en estos tiempos, es en la educación no formal, en la formación en la sociedad civil, en las organizaciones sociales. Así que bueno, la educación en línea tiene sentido si la pensamos también como algo que forma parte de procesos educativos más amplios, y que creo que después de esta crisis va a permanecer con nosotros, y también nos va a dar oportunidades de innovar y desarrollar otros formatos, otras formas en educación. Por ejemplo, pensar en cómo podemos aprovechar las ventajas de la participación remota desde diferentes lugares, de romper un poco las paredes del aula para hacerla más amplia, más expandida. Y esto pensarlo también como una forma de promover una educación más autónoma, más emancipada de ciertas formas muy rígidas. Dicho esto, creo que lo tenemos que hacer cautelosamente, reflexivamente y con sentido crítico, porque no podemos reproducir las promesas de la industria de tecnología educativa, las promesas de disrupción total, de educación solamente para la innovación o para la competencia, sino, bueno, tenemos que también desafiar esos discursos que nos vienen dados e impuestos por una industria global de tecnología educativa, que a través de grandes plataformas, por ejemplo, Google Classroom, por ejemplo, bueno, propiamente Zoom, en fin, las compañías que hoy en día están proveyendo estos servicios y desplegándolos de forma masiva, funcionan bajo un paradigma que no responde necesariamente a las necesidades de la educación, sino a las necesidades relacionadas con, bueno, con el lucro, con los negocios, en definitiva con un enfoque comercial, y que de algún modo también a veces se visten hasta como de filantropía o de bien social, y eso creo que tenemos que ser bastante críticos frente a esa cuestión, porque las plataformas que han venido a dar solución, entre comillas, a la necesidad de este rápido despliegue, están muy relacionadas con, bueno, con el capitalismo de vigilancia, con el colonialismo de datos, y creo que en el sector educativo tenemos que ser mucho más cuidadosos de estos aspectos que quizás en otros sectores, porque involucra derechos humanos, el derecho humano de la educación, involucra a menores de edad, en fin, tenemos que tener estas cuestiones presentes. Y también pienso que desde el punto de vista del movimiento de software libre, contenidos abiertos, educación abierta, también nos tendríamos que preguntar el por qué estamos promoviendo la adopción de este paradigma, del paradigma que, de lo abierto y de lo libre en educación. En primer lugar, muchas veces decimos que esto es una solución que puede ser más económica, incluso gratuita, y nos tenemos que preguntar si necesariamente es así, porque tenemos que pensar en la infraestructura, en los recursos humanos, en los recursos técnicos que se necesitan y que las empresas, las corporaciones, las grandes corporaciones tecnológicas ofrecen como un paquete ya dado en sus servicios. Y bueno, cuando damos la discusión sobre lo económico tenemos que tener mucho cuidado con esto. La educación abierta, el software libre en educación, es una forma también de ser cuidadosos con la privacidad y la seguridad de las personas que participan en la educación en línea. Esto me hace acordar a situaciones que están ocurriendo en este contexto de educación en línea masiva con la pandemia, como por ejemplo el software que se está utilizando para vigilar los exámenes, que los alumnos no se copien durante los exámenes, y se están utilizando herramientas que vigilan a través de cámaras web, que monitorean los movimientos del mouse, la expresión, el movimiento ocular de los estudiantes, para garantizar que no hacen trampa durante las pruebas. Y esto también es una solución que ha sido comprada por muchos gobiernos, universidades, escuelas, y eso nos lo tenemos que cuestionar mucho, y tenemos que defender que desde la educación abierta y libre estamos promoviendo una relación diferente con el conocimiento que la que tuvo siempre la educación más convencional, y que justamente usar estas herramientas tecnológicas para ponerlas al servicio de vigilar que la gente no se copie, en vez de poner herramientas al servicio de que la gente reutilice materiales educativos, comparta, intercambie conocimientos. Esa es parte de nuestra misión también, y de la narrativa que tenemos que construir. Y en definitiva, estamos hablando de que la educación abierta tiene que ver con una forma de hacer y de relacionarse más solidaria, para la producción de bienes comunes educativos.
Mari, un minuto.
Sí. Así que bueno, un poco para redondear, hemos visto con esta emergencia, con este contexto de emergencia, que a pesar de nuestros esfuerzos de muchos años de desarrollar educación en línea y recursos educativos abiertos, y que esos recursos han sido una gran solución y han sido muy utilizados, por ejemplo, los portales educativos en Uruguay, como el otro día decía mi colega Patricia Díaz, triplicaron o cuadruplicaron el acceso, el número de visitas. Aún así, los gobiernos, las universidades, las escuelas, para dar una respuesta rápida, han acudido a las corporaciones de la tecnología educativa. Y me pregunto entonces si estamos preparados como movimiento para esta emergencia, y pienso que en gran parte no estábamos preparados. Si me pongo a pensar en mi propio trabajo de los últimos meses, dando asesoramiento, o consejo, o ayuda, o implementación de educación con software libre, o con recursos educativos abiertos, me he dado cuenta de que a veces se nos plantean desafíos muy grandes, dar respuesta a necesidades masivas, que aunque tengamos software libre o contenidos libres, si no tenemos las infraestructuras, si no podemos dar respuestas de conectividad, se nos hace muy difícil dar una respuesta adecuada. Así que bueno, coincido con Alec en que tenemos que dar respuestas de más largo plazo, que nuestro movimiento no es necesariamente un movimiento de emergencia, ayuda en la emergencia, pero tenemos que aprovechar esta emergencia para construir el relato del trabajo a largo plazo que necesitamos hacer, porque no es solo poner allí los contenidos, lleva tiempo la adaptación de las personas, de los estudiantes, niños, jóvenes y adultos a la educación en línea. Hay etapas del proceso de educación en línea que no se pueden saltar fácilmente si la gente no está habituada, si los profesores, los maestros, las maestras no están habituadas. Hay tiempos de entrenamiento que son necesarios y eso lleva tiempo, lleva años. Así que bueno, con esto estaría cerrando, decir que creo que no estábamos del todo preparados, que ayudamos, pero que necesitamos planificación a largo plazo y continuar haciendo nuestro trabajo, nuestra advocacy a largo plazo.
Thank you, Mariana. I take from you two things. One, virtual education is here to stay, despite even digital divide. It's here to stay, and we need to prepare for long term, especially to probably stop or refrain from a model that is very much against what we believe. We believe in collaboration and cooperation, not in surveillance and individualism. So thank you very much for those words. And let's continue with our other side of Latin America, which is Brazil, the biggest country in the world, what a Brazilian said. With us, Alan Rocha de Souza. He's a professor at the university, the Federal University, Universidade Federal Rural do Rio de Janeiro, in the law school. He's a copyright researcher at the graduation program on public policy and development and copyright consultant for Fiocruz, Fundación Osvaldo Cruz. Thank you very much, Alan, for joining us, and we're here to listen. Alan?
I was muted, sorry. Can you hear now? Yeah. Thank you very much for planning this session and actually bringing all these friends together, which you haven't seen personally, but I wish I can see you all personally very soon. Delia, Alec, Mariana, and everyone else. So, so I'm going to take from where people have already brought. The digital divide also in Brazil in education is also very strong. It follows similar patterns as the rest of Latin America, with a few exceptions, because we did have in the last 2 decades some programs of digital inclusion, which doesn't mean that everyone is equal and all the problems are solved. But it seems to me that we have a little bit less of a problem in that sense than some parts of Latin America and some part of the world. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Actually, I'm going to focus on the college education, college and grad education, and even in the federal universities, there is still a huge divide, and we could see that because all federal universities, or at least most of them, and certainly the most important ones, have not returned to regular classes. They are offering courses which students can take, but they're not obliged to take. They're not going to have any prejudice in not taking it. They are not. So if they just don't want to take any of the credits, that's fine. Nothing's going to happen to them. It's not going to count against them, and so on and on and on. So it's making it easier for the college students to go through if they can, when they can, in the way they can. So it has moved online all of a sudden very quickly without really any or much training of it. So it's being, in a way, sort of a fixture, not a solution at all. So it's basically, so far, we've been trying to fix things. And this has happened in all levels. But I'm going to concentrate actually on the copyright issue. How has the copyright issue come about in the situation? I think the first thing that I noticed since March is that until then, there's a lot of talk about copyright among experts and one or another person within the education area that gets interested. But after the pandemic, once the pandemic became here and present, and very clearly it's not going to go away anytime soon, the copyright issue actually became much more present or much more clear. Everyone all of a sudden had the perception, realized that copyright is it's an integral part of everything we do as teachers and researchers, not only as just citizens, but as people and researchers, as teachers and researchers. And that became very clear at all levels to everyone all of a sudden. And there was a huge demand for what to do about copyright, what can I do, what I cannot do, and so on and on and on. So basically, that's all I've been doing since March. Explaining, taking part of lives, being part of Congress, answering questions of all different sorts of teachers. And actually, at the end of a few months, I pulled together a guide, which is what can we do and what we can't do, just answering questions that I was receiving by email and so on. This guide actually surprised me. It's open on, obviously it's open. And it surprised me of how fast it moved and how far it did go, how far it went. And that's because it became very clear how copyright impacts all the way through our activities. And one of the first impressions of the teachers was, what is going to happen with my classes? Who is going to be able to do what with the classes that I'm now teaching online? And that was a problem that didn't exist before. Of course, if you were having face-to-face teaching, the classes are there and they just move on, because you just taught that class, you move on, students move on, they write down whatever it is, you release the text and so on, and that's it. But now there's a problem, because now it's being recorded for most part, and it's being made available to the students, usually through the institutions. And the first reading of all of this is there has been in the private sector a huge takeover of teachers' rights in their classes. That's the first thing that we first noticed. And that was going to happen as well in the public schools and certainly the public universities. And that's where that I was more involved, and I'm still taking part of it. We reversed that in the federal public universities. Right now, it's on the high-level discussion on what kind of rights are going to be made available for the students and so on. We think this and also so that was the first thing. But at the same time, the teachers realized, and that's been a very good surprise, that how much in order to actually do that job, they do need pre-existing material. So at the same time that they realize that they are authors of the classes of the material they produce, they also realize how much their activity is dependable on pre-existing works. And that was when they realized, oh, there are limitations and exceptions. There is a right to education, and the right to education has to somehow have a dialogue with copyright. So that's the first time actually the teachers, and now I've been talking to some unions, especially more college teachers unions, but also other unions, and they are now for the first time aware of, oh, there's a copyright issues and we have to take that into consideration. This is the first time, and I've been talking about copyright in education in Brazil for at least 15 years, and this is the first time actually the higher level groups have actually realized we need to do so. And I've been taking, in the last month and a half, I took part of 3 major meetings talking to a few of them, especially at the universities, unions usually at the universities, and local unions for cities and councils and so on. So this is one first good step. And they've realized on both sides that they do need strong limitations and exceptions, and they also need some protection for the materials that the teachers produce. So this is the first time this is now on the table. This is being talked about in all different levels at all different like universities, cities, state, and so on. And then what happens? We do have within this scam, we've had the problem of access being very highlighted, which is really good. Access to education, access to existing material, what can I do and what can I do, and so on. And absurd of what supposedly you cannot do became very clear. It's like flashing in our faces, like, what do you mean I can't do this?
Alan, 1 minute.
Sure.
No, you can close.
Okay, go on. Okay, 1 minute to finish. Oh, sorry. And then what happened? We got the access, the public interest, and education limitations highlighted. And then what happened from there? What I've been doing, we do have a decision, and not one decision. We have a series of decisions in the highest court saying that the interpretation of the limitations in Brazil are to be interpreted extensively. Basically saying, implying there is an implicit, open, general clause to the limitation. So it's not only what's in the textbook, in the books, but also other cases, whereas the public interest is superior to the private interest. So that's already stated in the last decade. That's been consolidated in the highest court, and this is the direction that's given. Taking that direction, from that direction on, I have, with other people as well, promoted, okay, so let's now, if the Congress doesn't move, the institutions can move ahead and have and deliberate internally and create copyright rules for their internal functioning. And we've had so far 2 major universities that have approved it, the Federal University of Rio and also UNB, Universidade of Brasília, and a few other city places which have produced guides to the teachers and to the students. The institutions have actually regulated for this period and will now regulate for the following period, like for the regular period, which had never happened so far in Brazil. And all the determinations, the regulations, the dispositions are much broader than what the legislation says, but it's in accordance with what the courts say. So basically the universities and some cities and have taken into their own hands to actually produce and detail what kind of acts they can do and under what circumstances. So they've used the vacuum that the legislation has, the openness that it has, and actually, from what I'm seeing, we are colonizing that area of public interest, which means the relation between education and copyright, by actually acting it, by actually producing internal regulations, but also in making it happen, doing so. And also I see a lot of teachers actually now doing, a lot of cities giving guides, which means what can I share with my students, under what conditions can I do so? Can I do like share the entire book or material? Can I read aloud a kindergarten book and share with my students? That none of that is written in the law, but all is within what the court says. And yes, what we've seen so far in Brazil, yes, you can share material with students, you can use any material in your class, you can read aloud the book for your children, and you can share that with all the students, and so on and on and on. The whole guidance is now, we're hoping to consolidate in a more substantial document, but that has already been spreading around through different cities, different higher education institutions, and so on. So rather than waiting for a Congress, like a legal change, we are making the real change like on the field. So the institutions are doing so, and the teachers are feeling more confident in doing so. So that's what I can see is happening in Brazil. And in that vacuum, what happened is, now we do have all the institutions are aware they need to regulate copyright, and they will regulate taking in consideration the right to education, their role in promoting education access, and I'm definitely finishing it. Now they are going to implement, and a few of them are moving ahead with implementing open education resource policies. And the second one, more open access. And hopefully from there on, we are going to have much more open education for limitations for education in Brazil, even if the law doesn't change, but we will change how we actually do it, and that will become a fact. Thank you, and I'm sorry, Carolina.
Thank you, Alan. Don't worry. We still have some time to talk later. So it is very interesting what Alan just told, like it's going to happen with or without the law. That's a nice way of closing it. We are coming with our next speaker. This is Anuva Sinha. She's from India. Anuva is a researcher at Center for Internet and Society, and she works on various digital rights issues, including copyright law and openness. We cannot talk about this topic without India, because there's always so many things to know about India. Thank you, Anuva, for being here.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you to all my co-panelists for that very rich and informative discussion. Sorry, I'm just hearing feedback in Spanish, so let me just turn that off. Thank you. Sorry. So I will begin with sharing 3 important developments that have happened in education during the pandemic. And then I'll end with a couple of reflections on the state of the law. So in July, the Indian government sort of released the National Education Policy, and this basically sort of revamps sort of the existing system that we've had for so long. And this policy essentially replaces a document that was last passed in 1986. So this was a very comprehensive document dealing with a lot of issues, recognizing a lot of challenges, and the change environment that everyone's operating in. Although the document recognizes the digital divide, it also highlighted the acute severity of this digital divide in a pandemic. It recognizes that as a primary barrier in online digital education, but the document does not put too much of a focus on access to quality content online for reasons best unknown. There is a certain degree of focus on content available on government-run platforms. Also, for instance, content for teachers for their training. But there has been no discussion whatsoever about bringing more openness to that. I mean, last I checked, the policies continue as before. The content for online learners remains to be copyrighted. For teachers, teachers may use that content free of charge, but they have to seek prior permission from the platform owners, which is the government. So it's unfortunate that the policy did not deal with any aspects, be it sort of openness in school education, openness in higher education, open science, the importance of open educational resources. So this was like a huge missed opportunity. Secondly, there is a lot of activity around policy making happening in open science in India. So the principal scientific advisor of India recently announced the intention to embark on a one nation, one subscription plan, which would basically entail India negotiating with the largest scientific publishers and getting subscription access for a flat fee for its entire population. Now the modalities of this plan are yet to be known, but research produced by the public institution will be made available in open repositories. So that's green open access in play there. But I mean, this one nation, one subscription plan seems somewhat of a step backwards, because this is essentially diluting the stance on open access by paying the publishers for even legacy research that was essentially produced by public institutions. So to that extent, it does not seem like a very progressive step at the moment. The third development is that educational tech firms have entered the space big time. I mean, like Mariana and I think Nicola also mentioned in a question about the rapid commercialization happening in the space. So while there are no studies to sort of give concrete numbers as yet, and we also have not been able to undertake any sort of studies on attitudes or experiences of educators. But if history is anything to go by, a couple of years back, a local Indian regional government had sort of released a law which required edtech creators to take licenses from the government for making content that related to the standard curriculum. So this was also done under the premise of copyright. So essentially trying to get creators to get a license, to pay up fees to get a license over an idea per se, which was a regressive move back then, and it also sort of was not revoked. So, we just need to be super cautious about these kind of developments. We don't know what the responses to this sort of commercialization are going to look like. Finally, I mean, there's been a lot of lack of legal certainty in Indian copyright law. This has been the case pre-pandemic, and I think it just sort of got exacerbated now. So adequate levels of use and awareness of limitations and exceptions have not existed. And during COVID, while there were new legal problems that were being identified by legal scholars, copyright scholars, there wasn't much discussion happening in the public discourse. So these kind of challenges really received marginal or sort of scarce attention, unfortunately. And limitations and exceptions in India, in theory, sort of fare kind of better than a lot of countries on the openness index. But some key aspects are, very depressingly absent. For example, there is no framework for online libraries. So, they're very outdated for the current environment like that. And the other sort of gray area that has been identified is how would teaching play out when educators are uploading video using copyrighted works, and depending what are the sort of nitty-gritties around communication to the public, what is the sort of like what are the sort of legal implications it can have for the educators. So there's not too much knowledge around that either. So I'm just going to sort of end with saying that there has been a strong demand in this environment for educational content, online more so. But it can definitely be met with fewer barriers if some structured solutions would emerge to these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuva. Thank you very much. I would just mention that in Latin America, the One Nation, One Subscription happens in Uruguay precisely, because Uruguay is a laboratory in Latin America, 3.5 million people in a small country. Anything happens in Uruguay, which is wonderful, but it's not easy to escalate. You heard only 10% of disconnection. Uruguay is wonderful. Anyway, thank you very much for your perspective. I think it's always an interesting point of view that what comes from India. So our last but not least speaker is Francisca Susilawati. Sorry. She works for the Teachers Association of the Republic of Indonesia, PGRI in Indonesian, and in doing so, she has extensive knowledge on their challenges with intellectual property. Because if we're talking about education, and we heard some comments from a person who works for the state, and a lot of activists, followed by activists and professors. We need to hear the voices of the teachers as well. And Indonesia has a very diverse environment to show us some challenges and options. Please, Francisca, go ahead.
Thank you, Carolina. So my name is Francisca Susilawati. I know that's difficult to be pronounced by the foreigners. So I'll be speaking on behalf of a teacher because I'm also, beside of working for the Teachers Associations of Indonesia, I'm also a classroom teacher. So before I start my sharing, allow me to briefly describe the nature of our country. Indeed, yes, Indonesia is a very large country in terms of size of area and also population. So we have a very large diversity in terms of culture, religion, educational background, socio-economic and geographical conditions. So in the normal conditions, we do have problem on managing the quality of educations. Then on the early month of 2020, COVID-19 hit the world, and the first case of COVID-19 in Indonesia was found in February 2020. And that time, it was never crossed in our mind, the teachers, that the impact will continue and dramatically affecting all aspects of human life, including educations. The cases of COVID-19 in Indonesia is getting bigger and bigger day by day. Then on May 2020, the government decided to close schools and ask all students and teachers to organize learning process from home. So it's the dramatically shifting happened from the direct teachings to distant learning, from the printed learning materials, learning resources to virtual learning resources, from the human-based interactions move to technological-based interactions. No one has never ever imagined on the distant learning and how should distant learning conducted, and none of the school in Indonesia on that time has a settled plan on carrying the distance learning. So it was like being sent to a battle where we can't see the enemies and we don't know the battlefield. So that is the feeling that we have as a teacher. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to carry on the learning process. We don't know what to use because we can't use the printed book. We will have to think and shifting the normal learning process into virtual learning. So everyone in every school tried to figure out on coping with the new situations using their own way, using their own strategies, and there is no grand design that could be followed as the standard. So dramatic shifting happened and no one is ready for it. So really agree with what Alan said and also Alex said previously that we will have to take this as a valuable lessons and we'll have to take these pandemic lessons as a part of our future planning. So most of the teachers in Indonesia seems to face difficulties in conducting distance learning, not only because they do not know how distant learning should be held, but also because there are no supporting facilities that we can use to support distant learning. So in Indonesia, not every provinces or every regions has the internet access. So we cannot say that every school has the possibility or has the opportunity to shift the direct learning to virtual learning because we can't even find internet in some areas. And we also, not every family have a gadget or a mobile phone or even or laptop that could be used by the children to learn because we have different situations of the economical and also social status. So these conditions force the teachers to choose on visiting the students one by one, visiting, having the home visit on still taking care of the education process for the students. Some are fortunate because they're working in big cities. They're working in big cities and also working for a settled schools community who has the facilities. But that discrepancies lead to significant problems for Indonesia's educations. So the fastest and easiest way for us as a teacher is just to grab anything we can find in the internet, and as long as it's related to the lesson topic, then we just use it and share it to for the learning materials. The urge on having an available learning resources is stronger than the thought of intellectual property protection. So as long as we can carry on the learning process, then we will choose that way. So then the intellectual property protection will be the second layer of the problem. With that challenge, the Teacher Association of Indonesia decided to take and lead massive movement for teachers in Indonesia by organizing a free webinar and also virtual workshop. And it dramatically gave a very positive impact for the teachers, because on the first wave, we conducted 19 days non-stop webinar, also virtual workshop, with the 72 synchronous session and also 60 asynchronous session involving 100 speakers from around Indonesia. And we have 15,500 participants who are joining the workshop, because the teachers, they need to know how to conduct the distance learning. So then the urge of having that learning is very high. And that first wave teach us a valuable lessons that there is a big need coming from our teachers. Then we continue to the second wave. Then all the learning that has happened during the pandemic, we as the teacher associations take the further step by organizing coordinations with the universities under the PGRI. There are 45 universities now is working together on preparing the massive open online course for the university students around Indonesia. So that is what is happening in Indonesia during the pandemic, Carolina. So the intellectual property protection is becoming the second problem compared to the availability of the learning resources. Most of the teacher will think on getting the available learning resources first, then think about, am I using the right resources? Do I have the right on using this or not? So that is the descriptions of what happening in Indonesia. So through that webinar and also through the virtual workshop, we give the educations for teachers on how should we choose the learning materials from the internet, the countable resources, and how should we also give an honor and also respect to someone else's intellectual property. So that is the sharing from Indonesia, Carolina.
I was mute. Thank you, Francisca. Thank you very much for your insight. I think it was very useful. We are now about 25-30 minutes from finishing, and I would just like to open. We have had some interesting discussions in the Q&A. If anybody who's looking at could go in and check what the discussion has been there. But I think that for these last 30 minutes, I will just open the mic here for cross responses among our speakers and see how it go on, because I think there's a lot of things to say here. Please raise your hand. Let me know who wants to talk, and I'll be giving the floor. Nobody? Shall I then?
Yeah.
Okay. So I thought that there was a lot of interesting discussions proposed here. And I think that there is, for instance, one first thing, the communalities that Mariana and Alex said on how the movement should aim at not just discussing open for open, but on a broader set of goals that could separate or divide us from other models. I wonder if somebody would like to reach out and say what are the kind of things that we should be doing apart from thinking about openness, but beyond that. Does anybody, probably Alec, want to start?
No,
Alan, you want to start? Go ahead then.
Oh, should I go ahead or Dalia? Dalia is on the floor. We can go, okay. I think one thing that has actually been bothering me for a while, and that became very clear at this time, it's like how reticent, how shy we are from actually moving ahead and actually getting the practices that we want to happening. Even when there's some openness, even when the courts, even when the real interpretation, the legitimate interpretation of the limitations allow us to do so, we're still very shy on doing so. we actually almost like as if we wait for permission to actually do those acts that we consider are rights. They are fundamental rights as much as copyright are. And therefore, they need to be harmonized and compatibilized. Brazil has a different situation, or a better situation, in a way that the limitations are understood and taken as expression of fundamental rights, and that is by the highest courts. And that's already something that's ingrained, that's stated, that's clear. And also, it's very clear that any property, any type of property, including copyright, does need to have limitations, because it does have to be submitted to the social function of property, which is also in the Constitution. And even then it's all set in our favors. There is a huge resistance from the open access or the pro-education movements to actually taking hold of it, getting a hold of it, and actually making it happen. So I think that is my major concern. Like, are we going to take the chances that we have and move ahead and actually make a statement by doing so? So this is one thing. And I think we need to move ahead beyond discussion, the legislation, actually changing the practice in our favor. That's it.
Thank you, Alan. I think from a Latin American perspective, that is quite easy, because I believe that teachers do. And Francisca also said, if we are in the position of choosing between continue the learning process or asking permission, we will continue the learning process. But I guess it gets worse as the digital world becomes broader first, and the sanctions become much more closer to you. And that's probably what Delia wants to say, because she says teachers follow the rules. Delia, you said there are lots of similarities, but then when do we have difference?
There's loads of similarities. And I suppose the problem we've got is we've all got the same problems. We've all got laws that are very, very outdated. And most countries, and even though there's this huge push towards more flexible, open educational exceptions around the world, I mean, the reality is, even if governments agree this is the case, what you're dealing with was enormous advocacy from the rights holders and collecting societies. And you can even see this is happening in South Africa, where they've been trying to pass that legislation for ages, and now there's a constitutional thing. We see this in Australia, where time and time again, the policy-making government goes, yes, this is a really good idea. But again, the politics keeps on bringing it back. I loved Alan's story. I just kind of really enjoyed hearing that, you know, the courts, you're using case law there to kind of set up guidelines, because the courts have actually filled in a gap there. I thought that was fantastic. But I also think, you know, during these circumstances, even though we've got really outdated exceptions in Australia, we were able to use one exception because it was a special case to get where we needed to go. But the problem is, once COVID ends, that exception is no longer going to be able to use for a special case. So I think we just got to look at the reality, depending on where we are, that we need an ecosystem that talks about open education, OER, talks about exceptions, but there also is, alongside both OER and exceptions, there is the need for kind of some form of collective licensing that helps education, but that form of collective licensing has to have a really good transparency and governance regime, because I think one of the biggest problems we've got with the collecting societies, they're not very transparent, and they need to be more transparent. And that's one of the biggest problems we've got going forward. But, you know, that's kind of, yeah. So I think the COVID's given us an example to show how flexibility can work in many countries, but also shows us, like, you know, it takes years to get exceptions in, years and years. And even if the government agrees with you, you're stopped because of the advocacy and lobbying.
Does somebody wants to answer, continue? I don't see Anuba, but I guess she's okay.
I can see her, but blank space.
There's a question here. What are the main obstacles to wider OER adoption in your respective countries?
In Brazil, consciousness. Now they are aware, oh, we need that. We can't just be doing what we're doing, because some of the practices are not going, they're going beyond any extended interpretation of the limitations. So I think consciousness that like, this is something that we really need. That's something that Brazil gained in some of the institutions here.
And like to say, Australia perspective, the Department's education, you know, they really went gangbusters and anything they created being released under a Creative Commons license. So it actually helped that. I think one of our biggest problems, the OER movement doesn't recognize the need for exceptions or support opening in exceptions. I think that's a real problem.
Somebody else?
Yes, I think that maybe in Uruguay, the main obstacle could be copyright literacy in teachers. This is something that my colleague Patricia always say, because for teachers, the more natural things is to take the materials online, available online, to remix resources and create something without taking in account the compatibility between licenses, without taking in account the limitation and exceptions that they can apply to their materials. Well, in Uruguay, we don't have really good exceptions for education, and nothing that we really can apply to the build of open educational materials. But I think that probably copyright literacy is one of the obstacles. So teachers cannot see what's the difference between an open educational resource and just something that is available online to use for education.
I wonder if we want everybody to be aware, because once they are aware, if the cost is to pay a license, for instance, how many countries will be able to pay licenses? That's another question, right? Anyway, who else want to answer Joe's question? What is the OER? What are the limits on your OER adoption in your country? Okay, no one else. So there's another question on copyright exceptions. Go ahead, Alec, then.
Yes, I didn't unmute myself. I think this is a very interesting question for us where, as I said, the level of OER use is very high. And I think that this has to do with, as well, with the awareness that has been raised here, right? That I think these high levels of use of the openly licensed portal don't translate at all to an understanding of the open model. This is, by the way, exactly the same case as with Wikipedia, you know, for me, always the flagship open project. And this is a bit of a catch-22 situation, because I don't think we have the resources, and the teachers honestly should not. They are now overworked and stressed, and the last thing they need is copyright awareness courses. But at the same time, if they're not aware of the specificity of these resources, they cannot support them. I honestly think they see it as just one more resource. So in the end, the support for these open resources depends on a very small group, I would say, of policymakers who hopefully understand these resources and continue to support them. I would say that is the case. I'm optimistic that in Poland this became sort of a mainstream, but replying to also other things that have been said. So even, you know, there's always the limitation. It can still be this huge number of visitors, but of course the situation is not perfect. These textbooks are not complete. And a good teacher looks beyond them for many other resources and immediately, could be hitting a copyright law, and we're happy these issues don't emerge, but we're completely aware that the legal challenges can emerge at any moment. We've had in the past cases of so-called copyright trolling, where really educators, librarians, and teachers, and schools and libraries were accused of copyright infringement. And here again, it would be good to have copyright awareness, but we don't have it yet, and I think this is a very hard moment to introduce it.
Carolina, can I add something from the
Sure.
perspective of teachers? So me as a teacher, it's very difficult for me to imagine having or organizing a classroom virtually without using virtual resources for free, because the main thing that is crossed in the teacher's mind is I want to provide the best quality of learning resources for my children. That is one of the first thought coming in on the teacher's mind. I won't care about the intellectual property. It doesn't mean that I don't want to put my honor and also respect to the owner of that intellectual property, but then the needs of the educations. For example, I want to introduce the kookaburra bird from the Australia to my Indonesian children. Then I need to find the resources relates to that topic. I want my children who are only having the experience on living in tropical country to see the snow, to read the stories related to Christmas and etc., then I need resources. And that is actually the main idea of preparing the international mindedness children. So that is also one of the concerns that maybe we will need to think together on how could we help the teachers on providing the best quality of educations using variety of learning resources from the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisca. So we have some other questions here. I'll start with Teresa's. On copyright exceptions, what role can WIPO play to help move things forward?
I just answered, I just started that immensely, just as he had with the Marrakesh Treaty. Just signaling that this is an issue that needs to be done is already quite important as an argumentative issue within different countries. Certainly in Brazil, I'm pretty sure in the public debate in other countries in Latin America, that's also important. And I suspect in places like in Africa and some parts of Asia, this is also important. And until today, a few court decisions, the ones they referred to, they realized that like limitations and exceptions part of the whole system after the Marrakesh Treaty. So that discussion became over once the Marrakesh Treaty is being passed, at least in Brazil. Like, listen, yes, limitations and exceptions are internal part of the system. Therefore, the system needs to be balanced and harmonized with other rights. I think we need to push that message further to other situations and to other rights, right, like education right now. And I think this is the moment. I think this moment is also very key because very few people are going to be able to argue publicly against education in this situation and against excess the public interest in this situation. So I think we need to take the opportunity to push it ahead in WIPO and all different levels.
Somebody else wants to answer that one? There's a comment by Susana Isoko. Addressing Joe's questions, great responses from the panel. To add, in some jurisdictions is lack of trust in quality of OER, either out of ignorance or as a result of advocacy against. I had my country Uganda in mind. Sadly, it is used respected in some developed countries like Switzerland, although not labeled as such. Yeah, the issue of quality is always a critic by openness. Okay, so there was also a comment by Delia that I thought it was interesting, and is the fact of the lobby, which is really a difficult thing to do as activists. It's always the big problem, and I find it very hard to explain usually what the point of access is, of openness is. You've been doing this work of building bridges for so many years. I mean, building bridges because at the end, it's your, I guess it's part of your job as a state, as a part of the state. What are the key things, and this for any other of you, that one who should take into account when speaking, especially with those that have a complete different point of view from yours?
Provide evidence to show why it's not working, and a narrative. That's the only way that you get change. You have to kind of, you just have to do some super good research, get some good evidence, and say, well, this is the problem and this is what we're trying to fix. And that's the only way you can get through.
Anybody else? Because that's I think one of the main problems in countries like ours. I've tried to do, but it's always I end up against a wall, even trying to build evidence, because probably all the infrastructure that we've discussed here, access, lack of understanding from the teachers. So we end up having very strict laws that come from an environment of the North, and it's just not possible oftentimes without at least a lot of resources to build the evidence. So I wonder if there's something that we can do south to build evidence, a better level of evidence. For instance, we tried to copy some of the methodologies that is an overuse in Europe, and it just didn't work. It's impossible to use the kind of workshops that European teachers had, because when we came into a room with teachers in Colombia, what are the kind of digital resources that you use? Not digital, what are the kind of resources that you use with your children? I mean, no way, they don't even have a PowerPoint. So really, it ended up being very, very, very hard. I think sometimes we are, again, to go to Alex's point, if you go to a school, a private school in Bogota, then you can apply. But if you're talking about public schools, the gap could be very, very difficult to face. And I wonder, how do we do this? Because at the end, we end up with very, a level of enforcement that it has nothing to do with the reality of many countries. I think we have to close. We are close to close. Yes. So I would like each of you to have some small address, a small thing that you would like to leave here to the rest of the panel. And again, thank you very much. So who wants to start, or shall we do the same line of order? Anuba, you've been very quiet, so let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, this is a very critical moment, and it's unfortunate, at least for me, that when the National Education Policy for India came out, there was a lot of debate relating to certain topics in the policy, but there was no focus on access to content. The report discusses issues of equity, issues of digital divide, the inequity in sort of access to knowledge is also fleshed out in some places, but without any reference to barriers that exist domestically. And it's not as if in the recent times, this hasn't been discussed in the public discourse. If everyone remembers, there was this particular landmark case that came out in 2016, where the Indian judiciary held that institutes had the right to sort of freely distribute educational materials within the context of delivering education, and that provision was read out very expansively. Now, the fact in the online environment, is it being applied or is it not being applied? It's not entirely clear. So, yeah, I'm just sort of curious to see how sort of the response if there will be a response and how it's going to shape up.
Thank you very much, Anuba. Who wants to continue, or shall I continue? We go backwards. Francisca.
Thank you, Carolina. So the COVID pandemic is teaching us a very valuable lessons. So let's use this momentum to give a stronger underline on the terminology of educations for all. It's not only about sending the students to the classroom, but also ensuring that they get the best quality of learning experiences and also learning resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisca. Mariana?
After this conversation, a question that came up to my mind is how we will deal with the platformization of education through big tech education platforms, and how exceptions and limitations could work there in a world like, like a big platform as YouTube, or the kind of rules that I apply there where our struggle for exceptions and limitations are quite unuseful, because the content is under a closed garden. So here in ULUI, we will study responsabilidad de intermediarios, liability of intermediaries. In education, I think that for the future, we need to gather evidence around that. So I will keep with that reflections, and well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mariana. Alan?
Hi, well, I'm actually hoping that we will take this moment to actually make all the teachers and institutions very conscious of how much they need the limitations and exceptions to actually do their work. And wherever there is a chance, we must move on and act on it rather than wait authorization from the government to do so, as if we are waiting for the law to be on all sides. We know that the lobbies at the highest level are so strong all over the world that we have very little chance of actually getting what we want if we go through a real legislative process. But we can do otherwise. We can actually go to the field and actually make those practices happen. And once we make them happen, it will become also much easier to fight for them in the highest level. I think we may be too concentrated in debating it on the highest level, and we could be forgetting of actually making that work on the field at all levels by giving like very simple instructions that are within the limitations, but push a little bit beyond what the text of the law says. That's it.
Thank you, Alan. Alec?
First of all, I really agree with Mariana. I think that when we think about platforms, we see some limitations of our approach, and this is something we need to understand. Without, of course, I don't mean to say that copyright reform is not important. This is a crucial goal to ensure some standard exception. I hope this will happen one day at WIPO. But maybe to add just one more point, and this is not something we have discussed a lot, but in looking at what's happening in Poland, but we're also doing some case studies in other countries. We'll be sharing them in around a month. Teacher networks are really important, and we didn't talk about this because this is a different topic, but I think they're very important because even in places where people don't have access to resources, often people can connect even through very simple communicators. And we've been seeing that in situations where the system doesn't work, there are very efficient ways where just people connect with each other, and the more advanced ones share knowledge in peer ways. And I think we need to remember that maybe these are channels where we need to be inserting freely available and fair content. But I think this is also, again, this is not the typical work of open education, but for instance, in Poland, we are trying really to support these grassroots efforts. And of course, there is always a platform story there, as you well know. Usually these networks today depend on a small number of very popular communicators. Nothing, I think, bad with that in a pragmatic sense, but in the big picture, again, it leads to these questions: should there be a public solutions for this?
Thank you, Alex. So Delia, and thank you, Delia, Francisca, Nuva, because you're late in your places. Of course, the worst time is for Delia. So thank you for still being here.
Cool. And I really enjoyed this session. The only thing I'd like to sort of, in my mind, is like, we're talking about the right to education, and copyright and OER is only one of the things that's going to help us get to the goal of the right to education. And the only thing I wanted to say is we're talking about copyright exceptions as being one of the things that needs to be developed and worked on. Always remember that the other side of that equation, which is often the creator and perhaps copyright owners. So I just want to bring this element back. Remember what we don't want a free ride, we want a fair ride. So just remember that it's about fairness. There's three different stakeholders here. There's creators, there's owners, there's users like us. So it's about getting that balance right. It's not saying we don't want to pay for things necessarily, but we want to have that little green dot that allows us to do something in education. So just remember the fairness aspect of what we're trying to achieve as well. But fantastic session. It was worth staying up to 1:45 in the morning. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia. I think it's a very nice way of finishing it. So it's fair, not free. It's right to education. The goal is the education and the good resources. We need copyright reform. We have to worry about platformization. We need to push practices. Thank you very much to all and each of you. And please keep in touch during these pandemic times. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
¿Listos?